definitely follow on Twitter. So thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So you're in New York. Oh, and I should say you were word escapes me.
Surrogate for the Bernie campaign?
Surrogate.
Yeah.
For Bernie's 2020 campaign.
Yeah.
And you're in New York. So with today's news, I know how fucking pissed I am.
Yeah.
What is your thought process right now?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. The Democratic Party establishment keeps on finding new ways to make me just insanely angry at it. And so this is just like the latest in what is really like a long line of just being fucking terrible at basic democracy, let alone progressive politics. And so, yeah, it's really like an affront against, not just Bernie and Bernie supporters and our agenda, but just like really basic democratic principles. So I was glad to see actually that the Bernie campaign pushed back pretty hard against it. And I'm hoping that there's going to be a significant struggle around this because it sets a terrible precedent if it comes to pass. Yeah.
And my trepidation is we don't have a lot of time, before they print the ballots and what have you. That's what makes me nervous. I know Bernie got a lawyer and things like that. And there's actually a class action lawsuit that's been started today. But my fear is, what if this takes a month or something like that, or even longer? Like at that point, people already would have missed, their chance to vote.
Yeah, I mean, I have not really. I don't have a very good sense of the rhythm of it, and it's entirely conceivable that they're going to get away with it. It's going to kind of depend, as always, on the extent to which there's outrage and protest. It's obviously more difficult because of the lockdown situation to organize, but it definitely merits trying to push back as much as we can.
Absolutely. What is it like? I know, like as a fellow activist, what is it like going through COVID and not being able to get out in the streets when shit like this happens?
Yeah, it's fucked up. I mean, I think it's just such a bizarre situation for everybody as far as society and so just our daily lives obviously are just sort of upended. And then for politics, I haven't been on so many Zoom calls in my life, so that's part of it. So there's definitely still organizing happening, and for essential workers, are still going into work, and so there's still space for walkouts and strikes like that. So even though a lot of us, maybe most of us, are on lockdown, there's still space for in-person organizing, at least at work. But for like more broad protest, I think we're going to have to figure out whether it's possible and the means to make that happen. My guess is also once things open up a little bit, there's going to be more space for that kind of more protests in the streets, things like that. I don't really know exactly what we can do in the interim other than really try to support workers who are organizing at the workplace and then trying to do, use online mechanisms insofar as we can. But it's tricky. I wish there was some sort of easy solution for organizing, but capitalism keeps us divided and isolated anyway, and this seems to have exacerbated some of the worst aspects of that.
Absolutely. As far as New York goes, we signed, like, we have thousands of signatures. I'm in Pennsylvania, so I shouldn't say it like that, but we have thousands of signatures on petitions to not cancel this primary. And Cuomo waited till today and kind of did the dangling carrot, and maybe we'll consider it. So like you said, this is absolutely an attack on our democracy. As someone who has given to the campaign and who was a surrogate, I just can't fathom, like, I know for me, I would just be like a mess. I can't fathom. What else do you suggest to people who are just feeling like really hopeless right now.
Yeah, I mean, the main thing that I've tried to tell folks is, which is the truth, which is, I mean, we should still reflect on what we won through the Bernie campaign, because the general tenor right now is kind of despair and demoralization, which I think is understandable, both because of I mean, the pandemic then, but then also just, it sucks. We wanted Bernie to win. He didn't win. And so there's inevitably, when you get your expectations raised so high, it hurts if those aren't met. That being said, like, the left has just expanded light years beyond where we were 6 years ago, right? So in large part because of the Bernie campaign, not exclusively, but in large part on a national level in particular, the Bernie campaign was really able to change the national discourse. Obviously we wanted to win the White House, but it's not wrong what Bernie said, which is that we've won the ideological argument around policy. And so that's actually a really big deal. That's a policy watershed for the U.S. And the fact that you have a mass socialist movement now in the United States is not a small deal. We almost take for granted these things that are actually quite new and that are really major steps forward. So like majority support for Medicare for all, the fact that you have DSA have tens of thousands of members, even just in the 2 weeks since the Bernie campaign has ended, you had, I think, over 5,000 new members join DSA. So, it's not really all doom and gloom. The reality is that it was going to be very hard to win the White House in the absence of a strong left and a strong working class movement. And so the task then, I think, is not to kind of like abandon the project or to say it was a waste of time, because what we did is we built the political capital and, radicalized and organized millions of people that are going to be able to, over the coming months and years, win the types of things that we wanted to the Bernie campaign. So I on a personal level, I think I was probably just as sad as anybody else, because I really threw my whole life in for a year to this. This is all I did. But like upon further reflection, I do think it was totally worth it. And it would be a real mistake to lose sight of the fact that this was always not just about winning the White House, but it was about building a movement. And so if you look at the movement side of things, actually those gains are very real.
That's amazing. That is such good perspective. I find myself depressed as fuck lately because of all this. That's a really good perspective. I'm going to draw some from that. I digress a bit, but you are a writer, and you are the author of Red State Revolt, The Teachers' Strike, Wave, and Working Class Politics. So sorry, I can't read my writing. So what inspired that? And if you could just give a brief synopsis of what it's about to the audience who hasn't read it yet.
Yeah, the short version is it's a book about the teacher strikes that happened in red states in particular in 2018. So West Virginia, Oklahoma, Arizona specifically. People probably remember them. These were, it's the biggest eruption of strikes in 40 years, won huge gains despite being in like Republican-led states. The really big story is that it brought back the strike as a weapon to the U.S. political scene. These strikes won a lot of gains for educators, but I think ultimately the big story from the strikes is that it showed the power that working class people have, because normally we just feel powerless. And a lot of times, even like in the last couple of weeks, it's really easy to feel that way. And it's easy to fall into despair. And so I think that the strikes show, well, it's not just electoral politics. Electoral politics are a big part of it. And in fact, actually, the Bernie campaign helped inspire some of the key organizers that led these strikes. But it can't just be about electoral politics. It also has to be about social movements, and in particular, rebuilding like a fighting union movement and working class and bringing back the strike. And so that's what happened in 2018. I was trying to draw the lessons of that for the left more generally, as far as the importance of combining electoral politics with building a real fighting working class.
Absolutely. So as someone who wrote the book on that, can you see after this, COVID and everything kind of starts to, calm down, Do you see something like that taking place again? Do you think that people have the will to still get out and fight?
Yeah, I mean, I don't even think we need to speculate. There's actually been a upsurge in walkouts in response to the crisis, right? So despite the terrible conditions, and in part because of it, you have the most famous ones that people probably heard about are in Amazon workers walking out from the warehouses, but it's really across the board. You're talking about hundreds of workplace actions because people are just understandably scared of dying and aren't willing to let the profit motive and the power of their managers and the owners take precedent over their need to just not get a virus and die if they can avoid it. So I think there's been actually like a pretty important upsurge in activity. You've seen nurses in particular, obviously, have organized a lot for their health and for the health of their patients. And so I think we should expect there's going to be an upsurge in more labor activity and at the workplace and outside of it, things like rent strikes as well. But the reality is we're entering into an economic depression if we're not already there yet. And so that's going to pose all of these really deep economic challenges in addition to the pandemic. And so I would be really surprised, actually, if you don't see some forms of working class resistance in response to what really promises to be a very difficult situation for the foreseeable future.
Absolutely. What are some of the things that you think that we can do, but also legislature, state-wise, county-wise, can do as well to take care of people in this time?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing to do is to get organized if you're not already. The idea that you can just sort of be an individual activist or socialist is, I think, a myth. And so particularly because the pressures and the necessity just of the health dynamic right now is to stay socially isolated, it's even more important to be part of an organization so that you don't fall into despair. At a minimum, being part of an organization allows you to have a network of people that can give you the kind of confidence that the world can be changed still. And it's very hard, I think, to keep that level of optimism and confidence just on your own because, I just, even when you're in an organization, it's easy to succumb to that kind of despair. I've had to stop checking Twitter as much just because it's very bleak these days. But being like in an organization with comrades or whether it's a socialist organization like DSA, which everybody should join if you haven't yet, or a union at your work or a tenants union, whatever it is, the crucial thing is that you can only build power collectively. We can only build power collectively. And so in addition to just being politically right, it's also just on a personal level, I think, what keeps me going. I don't think I would be able to sustain this level of activism if it wasn't for having that kind of backup of a bunch of really serious and good and kind of selfless comrades who are fighting for people they don't know and fighting for a lot of things that we talked about in the Bernie campaign, but doing that, year round and not just when the election is going on.
So for people who haven't joined DSA yet, what, aside from, getting more comrades, what is something they can expect? What do you guys do? I know there's a lot of meetings, things like that at Belong, but what can you tell people about joining? Why should they join?
Right. Well, I mean, imagine I'm talking to like a Bernie supporter who hasn't joined yet, right? So I'll assume that you agree. I absolutely assume if you're like watching right now, you probably agree with the policy issues. And so the question is, well, so Bernie didn't win. And one response would be, well, we're screwed. I should give up. The reality is that's what the people in power would want you to do. I think we should probably actually just take the example of Bernie himself, who's been fighting for literally decades. And it's one of the things that we praised about him. And I think it's actually a little bit ironic that after the defeat, and it was a defeat, so many people who praised Bernie for that have sort of fallen into the opposite camp, where even though they're like, he fought for 50, 60 years, and now after 6 months, I'm going to give up. And so I just think actually you need a long-term horizon. And so being part of a socialist organization with a strategic vision is the way you manifest that long-term perspective. I don't think you can just do that individually. And so concretely what DSA does, and it looks different locally, is, we wage political campaigns on behalf of working class people. So that sometimes is electoral, right? So, famously, we helped elect Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, but also, 6 socialist city councilors in Chicago. There's a lot of other really great candidates that DSA has elected locally and statewide, even if we lost the White House right now. So there's a lot of good electoral campaigns, including in New York and elsewhere, happening. So I do think that one of the ways that we can continue the Bernie campaign, the ethos and the politics of that, is by winning democratic socialist candidates all across the country. And so that's one aspect. But I think just as important and maybe more important at this moment, is we're building power at our workplace and sort of more generally in the community. So we have a lot of focus on getting socialists into organizing at work right now, whether that's in a union or whether that's organizing in an unorganized workplace like Amazon. Now is the time. Even the capitalist media has to pretend that they support workers right now. So that gives us some sort of legitimacy and leverage that we can use to be like, okay, well, if you support, you say we're essential, why don't we have a union? Why are we still getting poverty wages? Why don't we have the necessary health and paid leave that most other countries have? So DSA is actively promoting this type of labor organizing, both with our members and giving support to workers who are asking for support. We helped a partnership between DSA and the United Electrical Workers Union in a new project called the Emergency Worker Organizing Committee, which is basically any worker across the country who's interested in getting help for them to organize at work, we will help you. And so that's personally what I'm spending a lot of time on right now. We've had hundreds of workers across the country get connected to us, and we've given them advice on how to organize, on how to fight back, to win both health measures, but then also economic measures in response to the crisis. So all of those things and more is something that DSA is doing. And so if you agree, basically, if you are a Bernie supporter and you're not in DSA right now, or you're not at least doing some other organizing, I get it, because it probably is, well, all of us were hurt really bad, but I definitely think that it's time to lick your wounds, but get back in the fight. And I think that DSA is the best place to do that right now.
I agree. Kind of not to contradict what you're saying, because I 1,000,000,000% agree. But as looking at Twitter today and looking at, what's trending and things like that, what's your take on people who are trending bring back Bernie? What do you think there's any hope in that? Do you think he'd even agree?
God. Yeah, it's funny. I would love to come back. I thought it was a mistake to have ended the campaign when he did. I get the rationale, and I think if it hadn't been for the virus, the campaign would still be going on right now. And so people, I think, were a little bit overly harsh with Bernie for that call. That being said, the reality is, being a presidential candidate just gives you this huge platform to fight for working class people, and we need Bernie's platform, and we need Bernie to be the leader that he is. And I think that, ultimately him being a candidate would be a better way for that to have an impact. I think it's probably very unlikely. I think it's probably extremely unlikely that he would come back. But who knows? A lot of crazier things have happened. The whole world is pretty crazy right now. So I don't know what the hell's going on with Biden. I don't even, God knows what he's doing or how his mental, capacity is holding up. So I would, I wouldn't hold our breath for Bernie to come back. But I definitely think that the sentiment underlying that is right, which is that we shouldn't rely on Biden. We basically need to have an independent voice within national politics. And that's, it could be Bernie, but it could be DSA, or it could be mass protests. It's that's the way forward.
Absolutely. Are there other candidates who not necessarily who are comparable to Bernie, but who are DSA that you look forward to, who are campaigning right now?
Yeah, totally. there's a lot of great DSA candidates all across the country. To give a couple examples, in Louisville, Kentucky, there we have a great DSA comrade named Robert Bell, who's a teacher, Black activist, participated in the walkouts. He's running locally, and I think he has a very good chance of winning. So people should check him out. Robert Bell in Kentucky. I think in New York, we have a whole slate of really amazing, fantastic candidates running to win for Albany for our state legislature. So people like Jabari Brisport and a whole other. I mean, we can go into the details if you're interested, but folks should definitely check out our New York slate of 6 different candidates, I believe. And really across the country, there's DSA candidates running. I think that one of the tasks that we have is to start winning locally and statewide, because it's going to be that kind of example of not just winning, but bringing about material benefits on behalf of working class people. That's going to make it so that we can win the White House either next time or the time after, who knows? Because the reality is, even though people agree with us policy-wise, there's still a pretty widespread disbelief that we can govern, that we actually really have the sort of project that is capable of taking power and that can make a difference in their lives. So there's a level of skepticism. And I think the only way of overcoming that is by building up a strong organization and showing in practice when we do win that we do make a difference. And if we can show that, it's going to be easier for like whoever's going to fill Bernie's shoes in 2024 or 2028 or whenever it is to win. And ultimately, that's what we're going to need in this country. But it definitely probably at this point is going to be more feasible in the short term on the state and local level.
Absolutely. I've had over 160 Bernie crowd candidates on in the past 2 years. So wow. Jabari was one of those. Yeah. Love him. He's wonderful. Here comes the one I just endorsed, Miss Lauren Ashcraft. Do you know who she is?
Yeah.
In New York?
Yeah.
Yeah, she's tuning in. Love you to pieces, Lauren. You are such a badass. She's one of the ones that collected thousands of signatures to keep Bernie on the ballot. So she is a huge ally in New York. Let me see. Somebody stated that DSA isn't very good organizing the rural areas.
Yeah, I think that's probably a fair criticism. To be honest, though, no, part of that is because it's harder to organize in rural areas because of the dispersion. But I think that's probably a fair criticism. I guess the question is, how and where we should prioritize our efforts, and I think that's actually not so obvious. That the rural areas are like the best starting point. I personally, I think that we should look where Bernie did best and where Bernie, as far as where we can have the most ability towards like building a really deep working class movement. And I do think probably actually that's going to be in big cities to start with. And it's going to be in, working class communities of color, actually, in younger voters. And it's just easier to organize in those places. That's not to say we shouldn't organize in rural areas, but it's not for lack of thinking that folks in rural areas are important, but there's just, it's very hard. But I would love to see, what is being done, especially at this moment right now, and see how we can emulate and support the comrades who are organizing that.
Absolutely. Yeah, Bernie is still on the ballot except for New York. That is correct. Lauren said, thank you both for fighting for us. Christina wants to know what you think about brand new Congress.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really have like a deep inside take on brand new Congress. My impression is that the limitation of brand new Congress is somewhat similar to the limitation of Justice Democrats, where it's good people running, but it's not necessarily actually linked to a broader political organization. And so that's, it's just a limitation. I think that if you're going to transform this country, and if you're going to have our candidates who are elected not just become sort of part of the left wing of the Democratic Party establishment, then you need to have an organic structure and link and movement to which they are accountable. And so just electing good progressives is not, I think, sufficient. I support a lot of the candidates that they've pushed, but I think that a better model that's going to really kind of build the power we need is actually more of the DSA model, which is, sometimes supporting similar candidates, but tying that to building a membership organization and having there be some sort of accountability and sort of broader political profile that I think actually needs to go beyond the Democratic Party. Like, I don't actually think that the Democratic Party is something we're going to be able to take over and transform. I think that we're sort of obliged, because of the anti-democratic nature of the regime we live under, to use the Democratic Party ballot line for the time being to build up our strength. But I think that the most realistic way we're going to see the type of changes we need is at a certain point to break from the Democrats. And I think that the only way you're going to move in that direction, as opposed to getting co-opted, is if at the same time as you're running as Democrats in races, you're kind of building up an independent organization. Because otherwise, there's just a huge amount of pressures to just kind of get absorbed into really what is like the left wing of the billionaire class. And I don't really think that's what we should aspire to.
Yeah, absolutely. So we do have a socialist candidate for president. And Christina wants to know, is the DSA party, is it viable to have a DSA party in the future?
Yeah, I mean, DSA at our last convention in Atlanta in 2019 actually passed a strategic resolution that informs our orientation right now, which is we are in favor of building a mass independent workers' party in this country. So we are not, we're not trying to get ourselves just like absorbed into the Democratic Party, and we're trying to build something new and better, even if we support some candidates who are running on the Democratic Party ballot line today. So yeah, so our like North Star, our horizon, is building that kind of working class party like most other countries have. The United States is, as most people on this call are probably aware, we're really kind of the exception. The question is, how do you get there? And I wish it were just easy, and I wish we could just sort of like declare a third party today and then have this philosophy of like, if we build it, they will come. The reality is, I tried that. The socialist left has been trying that for decades. We're just running third party candidates. And I think that it hasn't built up the type of mass political force necessary. So I think we are obliged for the time being still to run as Democrats, although, run as independents locally and statewide where possible. But that we need to accumulate more forces. You didn't even get most unions to support Bernie, right? And so the idea we're going to have a mass workers' party when most unions, we couldn't even get them to support, a democratic socialist running within the Democratic Party. It's not the case that most people right now are ready to just build a new party. Unfortunately, a lot of folks are just checked out of the political system altogether. And then others, even if they agree with us politically, still have some sort of like weird illusions or allegiance to aspects of the Democratic Party establishment. So I think that's going to take more political struggle, to be honest, to expose that and to build a real political alternative.
I agree. For people, it's still, even though Bernie started running 5 years ago, it's still so much confusion between what a socialist, a democratic socialist, and a communist is. What's the easiest way that you particularly address that?
I mean, I think the terminological questions are sometimes not the best starting point, because, like, so for instance, I consider myself a democratic socialist. Depending on the day, I also, I think that a lot of the tradition of democratic socialism that I identify with actually, people, you could describe that as communist depending on what you mean by that. I think that a lot of times when people use the word communist, it brings up the association of like Stalin or Mao or sort of like that Stalinist tradition, which I definitely don't identify with. So one of the good things about the label democratic socialist is that it foregrounds the reality, which is what socialism means, is expanding democracy, not restricting it. So I actually think that it's just, as far as our ability to win a majority of this country to overthrow capitalism, I think calling ourselves democratic socialists is both accurate and just better strategy than calling ourselves communist. That being said, I think that the goal of democratic socialist isn't just like a welfare state. It's not just replicating what happened in Sweden or Denmark, as good as that would be. And I do think probably winning something like that is a necessary sort of step in the direction where we want to go. But our horizon isn't just to like tame capitalism, but is actually to make it so billionaires don't exist, right? It's to make it so that the economy is under the democratic control of the majority. And so that, I think, is the goal of democratic socialists. I think it's also a goal of communists. And that differentiates us from like maybe social democrats. I think that's a useful distinction between democratic socialists and social democrats, where social democrats, maybe want a strong welfare state, but within the confines of a capitalist economy in which the majority of resources are run by and controlled by corporations. We basically just don't think that that should be the case. We think that actually the precondition for being able to solve and not just mitigate against the worst problems, whether it's climate disaster or war or racism and sexism, all of these issues, if we actually want to seriously get rid of them, that's going to require getting rid of the root of the problem, which is this ownership over most of what we need to survive, and our necessity, therefore, to sell our labor to this class. And we think that that sort of state of affairs need to be ended. And so, yeah, we're for getting rid of capitalism and not just sort of reforming it.
Absolutely. Wesley wants to know, what about DSA supporting a green candidate currently? We know that they endorsed Bernie. Of course, they haven't endorsed Biden. What do they think about endorsing a green candidate?
Well, I mean, I think we've supported Greens in the past, sometimes locally. Jabari Brisport, for instance, ran as a Green locally. My personal take is that the reality is the Green Party is not like a viable political alternative for most working class people at this point. It's it mostly just exists on the ballot line, and organizationally, it's not really connected to mass movements or to a strong working class base. It's relatively marginal. And so I think that the danger of running marginal candidacies that don't really have a chance of either building power or winning is that it gives the impression that we are a minority and that we're just doing politics for the sake of like bearing moral witness or like making the point. I just don't really think that that's what we should be giving as our message to working class people. I think what we want to be saying is like, actually, our politics represents the interests of the majority, and we have a politics that can assemble a majoritarian coalition, both in the short term and in the long term. And so part of that is like running candidates that they may not always win. It's like Bernie didn't win, but because it was plausible enough that there was a path to victory, it gave it an echo that I don't think that just running like protest candidates has the same type of impact. So at this point, because so much of our project is like getting the left to be beyond what we currently are, so I don't think we just want to talk to each other and sort of register our opposition system. We need to be able to win over other people. So I don't really think that the Green Party, as far as I've seen it, is like a particularly good vehicle for moving in that type of direction. Could be wrong, but I would rather see us focus our energy on like running Democratic Socialists as DSA candidates locally, statewide, and setting the groundwork in that sense for like a really robust working class party, which I don't think is going to take the framework of the Green Party.
Nailed it. I agree. As far as yourself personally, when did you start getting involved in, democratic socialism and activism and things like that. Was it because of Bernie in 2015, or were you active before that?
Oh yeah, I've been on the socialist left for a long time. I'm a red diaper baby, which for people who don't know what that means is it means my parents were Reds and socialists, and so I really kind of grew up in this labor family, and we grew up singing labor songs. Both my parents were socialists and labor activists, and so I've been organizing since high school, mostly in labor, and sort of I was a teacher, and I did rank and file labor work, and that's kind of public education organizing. So for me, actually, the electoral side of things is pretty new. Bernie was the first time that I really sort of jumped in with all of my energy, because to be honest, most of the times people running either were left protest candidates that just, felt really marginal, or were just kind of like liberal Democrats who were ultimately, bought off, I think. So Bernie represented something new for me. And so the experience has been really interesting to see what electoral politics is like. And it has its own sort of set of challenges and openings. I think it's been great because we have this immense impact on society as a whole. Like my non-political friends and family members were excited about Bernie. It was like one of these things that it's easy to forget about now because things feel sad, but we were able to shape millions of people and shape their opinions and give millions of people some sort of sense of power through their participation in the campaign. And that kind of breadth of politics and participation, which you get from being in a viable national political campaign, is just not something that's easy to do on almost anything else. Because part of the problem in the United States is that people see politics as just elections. I think that's actually a limitation, and they mostly focus on the presidential election, like way more than anything else. But that means that we have the necessity to kind of like fight on that terrain where we can.
Yeah, absolutely. Wesley, or excuse me, it was Nathan. He wanted to know if DSA is working on something like ballot initiatives to get things like ranked choice voting or open primaries, things like that.
That's a great question. I actually think we should be doing more on that. One of the things that the Bernie campaign has really brought to light is the necessity for democratizing this country, because it's just the deficit of just really basic democratic procedures is just stark compared to even other capitalist countries, which all of them have their own limitations. But just really basic things in this country would make it easier to have some sort of semblance of a real democratic process, despite the influence of billionaires. So yeah, I definitely think like ranked choice voting. I think that making it easier to get on the ballot line, doing things like taking the money out of primaries and of a lot of these elections, just basic norms that a lot of other countries have would even the playing field enough that it will make it easier to both elect democratic socialists, and it will make it easier also if we can democratize the regime to get things passed once they are elected, because it's not just getting people elected, but it's also, what do you do when, for instance, you get Bernie or some democratic socialist elected to the White House, but you have, a Senate which is totally unrepresentative that can block things, right? So I definitely think that like putting the question of political democracy as part of our strategic fight is important. It's hard because it feels distant to people, and it somehow feels like maybe a little wonky or a little bit disconnected from their lives. But I think as people go through this experience, they're going to have to see, well, look, if I want Medicare for all, if I want the Green New Deal, what are the obstacles to making that happen? And part of the obstacles for making that happen is just you have all of these crazy institutional roadblocks that need to be really pushed out of the way if we're going to be able to win the types of immediate things we need. So I think that the real task is to tie that democratizing plan and those demands to people's tangible like needs in their life, because I don't think you're going to get like a mass movement for ranked choice voting on its own. It seems a little bit abstract. But if you tie that to like, if we do ranked choice voting, then we're going to be able to win this, this, and this. Then I think you could see sort of the type of movement that you'll need to win those types of demands.
Right on. So this is something I literally just came up with. I had no intention of asking you this, but have you ever thought about running yourself?
Me? No, I don't think so. I think that, I mean, to be honest, part of the reason for that is it's stressful. And part of the reason is also, I think, DSA's limitation right now is that it's too, it leans too white and male. And so I think it's probably better to foreground our comrades of color and not white guys for the foreseeable future. So I think that's part of it. I'm very happy to just keep on supporting.
Good point. What can people look forward to for you? What's next?
For the movement, or for me specifically?
For you, like, are you doing, like, I know you were doing a book tour.
Yeah.
What are you working on now?
Yeah, well, at this point, I'm trying to refocus my energy in a way that I hadn't over the last year on helping, help build DSA. To be honest, for the last year, I was just so deep into the Bernie campaign that a lot of the DSA side of things, we sort of, me personally and others, I think we pushed it off a little bit, which made sense because we were doing labor work and we were doing Bernie work. I think now, especially as so many, Bernie supporters are looking for a new political home and looking for a new vision, it's a really good time to kind of try to consolidate that in organizational form. So yes, I've been working a lot with DSA. I'm part of the Bread and Roses caucus of DSA, which is it's a caucus within DSA that's trying to make DSA become a more working class organization. DSA is great, but we should also just note its real limitations, which is it's still, it's disproportionately white. It's not as rooted in the working class as we want it to be. And so I think we need to really proactively transform DSA so that it can become the kind of vehicle that, the millions of Bernie supporters who actually were very multiracial and very represented the working class, that they can see as their home. And right now, I don't think that's fully the case. And so we have work to do to kind of bridge that gap.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Do you want to give your website, your Twitter handle, all that fun stuff?
Yeah. So my Twitter's _ Eric Blanc. So that's _ ERIC BLANC. If you want to check out my writings, I write a lot for Jacobin. You can check out Red State Revolt, my book. I've got a website, but I rarely update it. So probably Twitter's the best bet.
Awesome. Well, I love me some Jacobin. I pretty much have a lot of Jacobin writers because it's the only magazine I trust. Well, besides In These Times, that one's fine too. But so thank you guys so much for watching. Speaking of Jacobin, I have Micah. You correct? I don't know how to say his last name. You know who he is, right?
Yeah.
Micah. I'm having him Thursday.
Great.
I have Luke Savage coming back. He's wonderful. And I'm having Shahid Buttar coming back, so that's good. And you guys were super happy last time I had Jen Perelman on, who's going against Debbie Wasserman Schill. She is coming back May 4th. So I'm booked the whole month of May, and I am going back on the Humanist Report because I have a huge fucking surprise. I'm not preggers, that's all I'm gonna say. But I'm gonna be announcing something really fucking awesome with Mike. So I will give you the date when that comes up. But other than that, thank you guys so much for watching, and thank you again, Eric, for joining us.
Yeah, thanks. It was great being on. Be in touch.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.